All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy McIntyre. I'm the lead educator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm joined here this evening by my colleague, Melissa Wynn, the Director of Marketing and Communications. She's going to be handling all the technical aspects for us. And I am so pleased to welcome our author for our Meet the Author event this evening, Melanie Kiechle. She is going to be talking about her really amazing book, Smell Detectives, An Olfactory History of 19th Century Urban America. Melanie is an associate professor of history at Virginia Tech. I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to give us a little bit information about herself, and then she's going to give us a short presentation on the book, just in case you folks have not read it yet, although I highly recommend that you do so. So welcome, Melanie. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tracy, and hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to you about smell detectives this evening. I do want to warn you all, we're not going to talk about anything that smells good. So I hope you've already eaten dinner. I am a terrible dinner guest for this very reason. But I'll get started talking a little bit about what the Civil War smelled like. All right. So, um, Smell Detectives covers the smells of the 19th century. But right in the middle of the 19th century, of course, we have the Civil War. And the Civil War smelled pretty bad. So that's what I'm going to focus on for you all. But I just want to note that there's a lot more in the book than what I'm going to share here. What the book really does is it explains how Americans grappled with their growing cities when they believed in miasma. Miasma was a medical theory that existed before germ theory, and it argued that bad air is what caused disease and death. I wrote the book before COVID, so this seemed really wild and strange, and I think it's a bit easier to understand this idea now that bad air could make you sick. So when we talk about miasma, it doesn't have to smell bad, but smell was a really strong sign for Americans that miasmas were in the air and could make them sick. The definition of miasma is the effluvia of any putrefying bodies, so anything that's rotting, rising and floating in the atmosphere. So if you know anything about the Civil War, you can already guess where miasma is going to come into play. What I want to do is take you on a short olfactory tour of the Civil War. And there are lots of sites within the Civil War that smelled strongly and made people think about miasma. But I'm going to focus on two tonight. The first are camps, and camps are really important. One of the things that I was doing in writing this book was I was writing about cities. And how did Americans understand their cities as they smelled worse? Like, how did they make peace with that? The Civil War seems like it shouldn't be a big part of this because, like, while there are cities, there's the Siege of Richmond, a few other places. The big cities are in the Union, they're in the North, they're not under attack. But everyone who was experiencing the Civil War wrote about their camps where soldiers gathered as instant cities. And so that's really the first place that I want us to look. And we're going to look by following the United States Sanitary Commission. These are physicians and reformers who had been trying to promote public health in American cities before the war. Once the war started, they turned their attention to the instant cities, to these camps, and tried to help make things healthier for soldiers by stopping the spread of disease. Once we have a pretty good sense of the camps, we're going to go to Andersonville Prison because Andersonville was the nightmare of the Sanitary Commission. Everything that they tried to implement in the camps of Union soldiers was the opposite at Andersonville. And so we can talk about how soldiers understood the dangers and the bad smells as they were encountering them. I have a lot of details, but most of them are in the book, so I'm going to try to skip heavy quoting for you. But there are some stories that I think are just much more vivid when we get the soldiers' words themselves. So I do want to share that. Um, let's start with the camps. From the very beginning, camps made an impression on those who had volunteered for war. A man from Michigan by the name of David Lane wrote in his wartime diary that the intolerable, nauseating stench that envelops military camps disturbed him. Some pretty strong language, so I think the disturbance was strong. Lane discovered that the war was changing him. He said, "My olfactories have become so acutely sensitive that I can smell an encampment from afar off." War correspondents agreed. These are the reporters who wrote back to newspapers. In 1862, the second year of the war, the New York Daily Tribune was reporting the army is really crowded. So much so that every bit of neutral ground between adjacent camps becomes, unless extreme care is used, a cesspool of abominations with as many distinct odors as Coleridge credits to the city of Cologne. I read this and I was like, what are they talking about? They're talking about a pretty famous poem in the 19th century. Um, there we go. That Samuel Taylor Coleridge had written in 1834. He was writing about the German city of Cologne, where he counted 72 stenches, all well defined, and many stinks. This poem made its way into American culture as a shorthand for the worst smelling cities. So when reporters said that camps were like Cologne, they're doing the same thing that soldiers like Lane were doing. They're comparing camps to cities because those are the only places they knew that smelled so badly. Now we know that disease raged in the camps. Of the 750,000 wartime deaths, approximately 2/3 were caused by diseases rather than bullets. This deadly fact did not surprise William Hammond, the Surgeon General of the United States Army, because Hammond looked at the camps and he compared their population density to the world's largest cities. When he did this, he discovered that soldiers in camp, their population density was higher than even London or Birmingham. So Hammond, we're trying to understand the health and improve the health of the army. He concludes that camps are more unhealthy than large cities because less attention is paid, oftentimes necessarily, to those points, such as sewerage, draining, heating, ventilation, which exert so great an influence over the health of inhabitants. Others wrote about the camps as instant cities, like the Wisconsin physician Alfred Lewis Castleman. He called the camp a city of tents that stretched for miles and made an impressive sight. That's what we can see in this photograph from the Library of Congress, right? Just tents as far as the eye can see. But by night, Castleman said, the views over the camps are beautiful. By day, the stench and noise is abominable. So, as camps became overcrowded cities, they rapidly developed the problems of urban life. Physicians had been trying to improve health in American cities before the war, and they turned their attention to the camps almost as soon as the Civil War started. Sanitary inspectors were created by the United States Sanitary Commission, and they used the same methods to investigate the camps that health reformers had been using to investigate tenements in cities before the war. They visited camps, hospitals, prisons, and battlefields. They have detailed records of poor conditions, and these physicians pushed the agenda of disease prevention. As it had been true in cities before the war, eliminating smells and providing fresh air were among the sanitarians' chief concerns. Now, the first thing that the Sanitary Commission thought about when they looked at tents like this, when they looked at the instant cities like the one you're seeing, is how can we have better ventilation in these tents? Because of miasma theory, they wanted to make sure that bad smells weren't building up in the same spaces where soldiers spent all their time and would be inhaling the air. They thought And really they believed, this was what they knew, that everyone needed to inhale fresh air for health. So physicians and soldiers both preferred this tent, the Sibley tent, which the US Army adopted at the start of the war. The Sibley tent is conical. It resembles the teepee of Western Native Americans. But the thing that physicians really cared about was the circular opening at the top. This provided ventilation and an exit for stovepipes. So we might think now the really dangerous thing would be to like have a stove inside a tent because all of the carbon monoxide would build up. They don't know about carbon monoxide yet, but they do know you need an exhaust, right? For that. And the Sibley tent provided it. When the sides of the Sibley tent were raised, the ventilation was perfect. Fresh air would come in through the bottom, and that hot air that rises would also carry all of the exhalations from the soldiers out through the top. This was an improvement over the wedge tent, though the wedge tent is far more common, because a triangular shaped tent that was closed tightly, as the wedge tents you're looking at are, that would exclude the cold temperatures. You can see off to the right, it looks like soldiers have reinforced those tents with some wooden boards to keep the cold out, but it also meant it would exclude the fresh air. So the Sibley tent is the one that sanitary inspectors preferred, but still they often found that ventilation was deficient. In September 1861, a sanitary commission inspector reported that a Maryland camp was in shocking conditions and the tent ventilation was neglected. Part of the problem was overcrowding. The Sibley tent was designed for 12 men, but often far more were crowded inside of it. And the results of this overcrowding were disturbing. An inspector reported that, quote, going into one of these tents in the morning, just after the men get up, gives an idea of what the Black Hole of Calcutta was. The stench is terrible. This is another common reference that comes up in the 19th century, the Black Hole of Calcutta. But what they're talking about is a tale that has grown into a legend. That the men who are in these tents are going to die by strangling themselves on air that lacks oxygen. Soldiers also noticed this problem. They would talk about the smells of the tents. In a man from Massachusetts, John Davis Billings, he wrote about the design of sibling tents as being good, but then he complained the frequently neglected ventilation to urban housing. And he said, in cold or rainy weather, when every opening is closed, they are the most unwholesome tenements. Here's a tenement. And I want you to look at just how crowded this space is, but also notice the way it gets darker as you move further and further in. The artist is using this image and the lack of light to also show the lack of air. And this is what that soldier's talking about, that his tents are terrible. Billings said, the accumulation of nauseating exhalations from the bodies of 12 men makes air of the vilest sort, and it's surprising to see how men endured it as they did. Billings is surprised because what he understands, even though he's not a physician, is that all of those bodily exhalations should cause nausea and illness. Now, before you worry that everything is atrocious, which, to be fair, it was, I do want to say that when physicians took control of camp environments, they insisted on ventilating these spaces and in cleaning up in all the rows between tents. Castleman, the physician from Wyoming I talked about earlier, Wisconsin, he had his tent struck, entirely taken down, so he could put disinfecting powder all over the ground below it. And then he inspected every single tent in his regiment and ordered all of the soldiers to raise the bottoms of their tents daily to make sure that they would ventilate. Castleman reported that there were immediate results to these changes. The sick list has already, in 6 days, decreased by 50 in number. So, one of the things that happens in the course of the Civil War is both physicians and soldiers had a new appreciation for fresh air because of their experience in camps. Now, latrines are a major problem for this, and I'm happy to answer questions about latrines should you have them. But this is the reason. Like, one of the things that they learn about smell is that they have to move latrines away from camps. They have to keep a lot of these things further afield in order to make sure that everyone can breathe fresh air. So that gives you a sense of what camps were like. And the camps could be pretty bad, but nowhere was as bad as the overcrowded prisons where prisoners of war were kept. And I just want to show you an image that's truly wild to me. And what this is a massive illustration of Andersonville Prison. It's showing us a few things about the prison. One, we can see that there's a creek that runs straight through the middle of it. That's a problem because there are Confederate soldiers camped up creek and all their latrines are running in to that waterway. So all of that waste is then running through this prison. And of course, the men that are inside the stockade, they're not able to get away from it. The other thing you can see in looking at the image, and this is a massive illustration when you see it in person, so it might be a little difficult on your screens. All those black dots inside that the stockade, those are people. This is trying to show us how incredibly crowded Andersonville Prison was, far more crowded than even the worst camp that Hammond was writing about. And then around the edges, we're going to zoom in a little bit because there are illustrations of particular problems that happened in Andersonville Prison. And these are the problems that were the nightmare for every sanitary commission physician. So first, flooding. Now, the flooding is a problem because all of that water is full of excrement that's coming from soldiers in other camps. It's knocking down the stockade, which might seem like an opportunity for freedom, but soldiers, if they tried to escape, would have to wade through all of that water, which is full of filth. And I can see from Tracy's face that she doesn't want to do that. I suspect you don't either. So here's one clear health problem because of the creek that runs through camp. The next thing is that all of these other camps that are upstream look calm and orderly in our image here, but note that we have lots of tree stumps. They've cut all these trees down, these are pine trees, in order to build that stockade. Pine trees are understood to improve the air, that the odors that are given off from the pine are essentially like a disinfectant. Lots of sanitaria are being created within pine forest in the same period that the war is being fought. So this is the opposite. By removing all the pine trees in order to build the prison, soldiers and physicians understand that they've removed the thing that can improve the air for all of these men who are concentrated at Andersonville. And of course, the results are illness. This image actually, you can see some numbers in it. It has a guide to explain what illness we're seeing here. But the biggest illness that was rampant at Andersonville is dysentery. That's a diarrhea disease. And so just think about all these soldiers completely crowded in, denied latrines, with only that creek that's already fouled running through the camp. I'll let you imagine the smells. I don't think I really need to give you the details, but that's what we're talking about, and that's what we're looking at when we look at Andersonville Prison. After the Civil War, the commander of Andersonville Prison was charged with what we would now probably think of as crimes against humanity. Commander Wirtz was a physician. And this is a major key to the charges against him, that as a physician, right, he knew that the conditions at Andersonville could not help but kill the men who were there. And so when he is tried by Congress for all of these conditions, this is one of the things they refer back to, the ways in which the Andersonville prison sickened soldiers by design. The Union troops who arrested Wirtz charged him with maliciously, wickedly, and traitorously confining a large number of prisoners of war in unhealthy and unwholesome quarters in a close and small area of ground, wholly inadequate to their wants and destructive of their health, which he well knew and intended. That is a full quote coming from their indictment of Wirtz. And so when we look at what was happening in the camps and how the Sanitary Commission was trying to fix these things, we can see how they would apply that same understanding to Wirtz, ignore all of the economic issues that he did not have control of, and say that this was by design, right? That Andersonville was designed to kill soldiers because it smelled so bad. You may need a palate cleanser. I love lilacs, and so too did 19th century Americans. Fun fact, lilac bushes are often planted around outhouses in order to block those smells from getting to the house. But I want to just end my formal comments with the lilacs so I can draw attention to a poem by Walt Whitman. Whitman wrote When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed to commemorate his mourning for Abraham Lincoln. He learned that Lincoln had died in springtime, so he forever associated the smell of lilacs with the loss of Abraham Lincoln, who he admired. He was in the North. But one of the things that this poem drives home for me, and I hope that you will remember it, is the way that the smells that people encountered during the war were strongly impressed upon them and brought back particular memories, right? So if the smell of an overcrowded room or an overflowing latrine takes one back to the camp or to Andersonville prison, right? If that triggers that memory, it absolutely would help these people to say, yes, physicians should be doing more to protect our health. And that ultimately is the larger story that I'm telling in Smell Detectives. There's a full chapter with lots more disgusting details about the smell of the Civil War in the middle, but also lots of fragrant tidbits about what life was like in 19th century cities. So if this has interested you, I would love to hear your questions, but I also hope you'll be able to grab a copy of Smell Detectives from your library or your favorite bookseller. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. And yeah, we actually are offering smell detectives for sale on our website, on our online store through the museum. And we also have, if you want to come to the museum in person, we have it in our bookstore. So that's a little plug for our museum there.
Yes.
Thank you, Melanie. That was fascinating. And I'm glad thank you for concentrating on the Civil War.
Yeah.
That was really great. But as Melanie mentioned, the book is full of so many other examples of in civilian life and before the Civil War, after the Civil War. It just covers so much information. It's really, really interesting to see how the whole idea of smell has progressed. I found that fascinating. Melissa, do we have any questions from our audience?
We don't have any right now, so I'm just going to remind people that you can ask questions by putting them in the comments on the Facebook Live feed here, and I will monitor those. We have a couple of questions ourselves, of course, for Melanie, and while we're answering she's answering some of those, perhaps the audience will put some questions in the comment section, and I will bring those forward.
Okay, thank you. Well, one of the things that I found interesting on the Civil War chapter was the idea that the Civil War changed smells and their meanings and made Americans, I'm quoting here, made Americans amenable to giving physicians political power over sanitary conditions. So do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really interesting when we think about this period is that most Americans do not live in cities at the time of the Civil War. They live in small towns, they live on farms. They may have been to a city once or twice, but cities also weren't as big as they are today. And so the industrial concentration that we associate with cities, that really ramps up during the Civil War as well. So, for people who hadn't lived in cities before the war, some of the things that they were being asked to do as soldiers were really strange. Like the idea that they should be gathering, like everyone should be going into the same place to relieve themselves when there's fields and trees around, right? Um, Most people hadn't, while they were familiar with an outhouse, they were not familiar with a latrine where hundreds of people are relieving themselves in the course of a day. And of course, as dysentery and other diseases that cause diarrhea proliferated, things got really nasty. So, for the soldiers who experienced this and who saw the changes of what happened when a physician took control of the camp, like Castleman, the physician from Wisconsin who forces everyone to ventilate their tents, who forces people to like go to the latrine. You can't just relieve yourself in between the tents in the camp. Um, they then see like how that matters. It changes the smells, but also they see in real time that connection between taking control of the environment and fewer people falling ill or people recovering much more quickly. And so that's one of the reasons that I think coming out of the war, so many more men have met physicians now. That also wasn't a common thing before the Civil War, but they've also seen how the advice that physicians have, even if it seems somewhat silly, like that you have to use the latrine, how that really made a difference in their own health. And so that's why I think when you step back, we can see how public health, the idea that physicians could protect the environment and prevent disease, that's something that no one was willing to accept before the war, and it's very popular in America's biggest cities at the end of the war.
So they were sort of learning by example, in other words.
Yeah, I
They,
mean, it's the
yeah,
experience.
and the exploring by experience, right?
We
And
do
one of
have
the
some
things too.
questions coming in
Oh,
too, so.
oh, good. Okay, go for it.
So I have a couple of questions on right now. One of them did deal directly with Henry Wirtz, as you had originally discussed, and just wanted to understand a little bit more what your thought was on his defense of his. He specifically, I guess, defends and argues that he tried to alleviate the suffering of the Union prisoners, but was unsuccessful because of the Confederacy's limited resources at the time.
Yeah, he makes that argument, and everyone who's at the trial is not having it. Prosecutors end up taking Wirtz's medical knowledge and they use it against him. They
Interesting.
argue that because he had that medical knowledge, there's no other way to understand this than that he deliberately created an unhealthy environment. Um, they actually say that, and I have this quote written down because it's so shocking, that he had done this. This is the prosecutors making the argument that Wirtz had created that unhealthy environment to pursue an evil purpose of killing 13,000 soldiers. So
Wow.
because he
Wow.
was a physician, I mean, and it really is because he's a physician that they're not willing to let him off the hook. Like, I
Yeah,
think
that's
if
interesting.
Wirtz hadn't had any medical knowledge, counterfactuals are always really hard to do. But because he had medical knowledge, that really built the case for the prosecutors that this wasn't an accident.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know, then there's the counter argument about, well, did he have the funds or the manpower or the supplies to remedy the situation? That's the other other arguments.
Yeah. And they just were not interested in hearing those limitations.
Right. Of course
Um,
not. Yeah.
And so, 13,000 prisoners had died.
Yeah.
It's hard to think about that and to think that people would be like, well, there were extenuating circumstances.
Right.
Especially if some of these prisoners had been, right, their fellow soldiers that they knew, or relatives, or neighbors, right? And that's
Yeah.
where the personal aspect of the war is something that we have to remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have a couple of other questions also. We have one question online about surgeons, speaking of surgeons,
Yeah.
and how would they have used smell to determine the healing of wounds? Or did they do that?
That's a very good question that I don't entirely know the answer to. They certainly would use smell to diagnose that there was an infection and that perhaps an amputation wasn't going to work because the limb was becoming gangrenous. Um, a lot of the changes that surgeons make during the war are about where they operate and how they operate. So the big way in which they're using their noses is not necessarily to determine if someone's healthy, but they're trying to operate in open tents. They realize very early in the war in Washington, D.C., that men recuperate better in the open air tents than they do inside hospital buildings, or there weren't a lot of those houses that had been hastily converted to be hospitals. Also, barns became hospitals. So surgeons recognize that there is a connection between better ventilation and better healing. And so they are pushing for more open air tents and what they call tent hospitals as opposed to changing buildings. And I
Okay.
apologize if my screen's flickering for any of you. Apparently, Virginia Tech is closing for tomorrow and they take over my computer to. So,
Snow day.
yeah.
Hooray. We didn't actually get the alarm, so.
Okay.
No, we did not. No, I
I
didn't
just keep
see
getting
it.
a flicker, so that's perfect.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, we don't see that either. So we also have some questions about smells. I thought that one of the really interesting aspects of your book too was hearing how all of the different ways that people used to control smell or to distract from it, the perfumes and stuff like that. And we have somebody who's asking specifically about flowers, since you mentioned it. Her name is Catherine Ann. She's asking, is it during the 18th century or 19th century that the tussie mussy is invented or thought up? It's referring to small bouquets of flowers that hide the lack of bathing smells.
Oh, so that is a fantastic question. I'm not familiar with using flowers to hide bathing smells, though it makes
Okay.
sense. But if you think about images you've seen of people in the 19th century, they often are wearing a flower. Like men would have a flower on their lapel, women are carrying handkerchiefs. Those are actually olfactory defenses.
Yeah.
So the point of wearing a flower is not to look dapper, though of course they do to us. It's so you could bury your nose in that flower when you're walking past a slaughterhouse or you encounter like foul water at the corner of an intersection. The same thing is true with women's handkerchiefs. They would carry perfumed handkerchiefs with them as they moved throughout the city so that they could cover their noses, so they can inhale something that they thought smelled good. They thought that that would protect their health from the dangerous air, right? If they were breathing in a really good smell. And then people, when they like you look at houses, all the window boxes that were often on in city houses, those are not ornamental. There were very specific guidelines for what kinds of plants to have so that they would freshen the air as it came into your house. Without air conditioning, everyone was kind of at the mercy of how the city smelled in the summer. And so that was
Interesting.
something that people did to try to help.
That's interesting. In the book too, you mentioned a lot about charcoal, the use of charcoal
Mhm.
too. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Tracy, I'll let you ask a question, and I'll get some of these other ones
Okay.
together for.
Well, I'm going to make a comment and then I'm going to ask a question. When we have one of our museum galleries depicts the inside of a general hospital ward, and we've got the greenery hanging from the rafters
Oh.
that they use to help, freshen the room. And they also apparently used bowls of iodine under the beds of the patients to freshen the air as well, which we always talk about, and the cross ventilation that they had going on with the windows on both sides of each ward with the cross ventilation as well. So it was definitely on the minds of the people that designed the hospitals for sure.
Yeah. I'm so glad you include the greenery because
Yes.
it's like they understood it in the 19th century as a disinfectant, which is just because they understand the infection is traveling through the air. And it's so easy to overlook it because that isn't the way we've primarily thought about disease traveling until quite recently. So yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple of photographs, period photographs of the inside of some general hospitals in Washington, D.C., and you can see the greenery hanging in the rafters in those photographs. And I always point out to visitors, it's not that it was Christmas time.
Mhm.
It's, they were using it to freshen the air. One of the things that I was really interested in too is there's a section you talk about the use of chemical disinfectants in the Civil War hospitals, and how the smell of the disinfectant sometimes bothered them more than the actual smell of the sickness. And I don't know, would that go on over into civilian life where somebody would say, well, gee, I really don't want to use this disinfectant because it's going to smell my house up, or I don't know.
Yeah, this is one of like I found this like two lines in a journal that I thought were really funny. It was a medical journal and it was talking about someone who was, a student trying to pass their exams and they were asked how the disinfectants worked. They're supposed to be answering this question, scientifically. And the student wrote instead, it smells so bad that you open the windows and let fresh air in. Um, and so, there's a little bit of like, we have these new chemical disinfectants, but we still think fresh air is better. Um, and and so like both of those were coming together. I do think the chemical disinfectants are important, but it is difficult to see like if people use them at home. Quicklime is the thing that people use the most because that would arrest decomposition, which means things wouldn't rot as quickly or smell as bad. But the new chemicals that are being advertised after the war, a lot of times people prefer the things that they were familiar with. And there is literature on like why our cleaning agents smell the way they do. Pine Sol smells like
Right.
pine because people
Mhm.
thought that was a healthy smell. And the same thing for lemon. Lemons were regularly used to clean. So when you go down the bathroom cleaner aisle and you see the Mr. Clean is like strong lemon scent, it's the same. It's the idea that it's the smell of cleanliness, even if it's a different way of achieving it.
That's
Interesting.
yeah. My mom used to use Pine Sol all the
Oh
time.
yeah. hmm we have a question from Richard Bloomberg online here that is asking, does the book discuss the impact of emanations from the decomposition of human and animal carcasses? And was the animal waste usually disposed of in the same water supply as the latrines? Were these things mixed together? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the sanitation aspect of animals and the decomposing body.
Yeah. So actually the Civil War chapter opens up, and I didn't read this out to you because it's right after dinner time. I don't want to upset anyone's stomach, but it opens up with a really striking passage from a soldier's letter where he's writing back to his family in Maine. He's explaining to them what the battle was like, and he describes what he smells. And so there's coffee, there's bacon, and then there's rotting bodies of both men and horses. right next to him. And he's smelling all of those things together. And what he tells his family is that this is a sign of how he's changed. Like in the past, he wouldn't have any appetite with the smell of those rotting bodies. But now he can do this. And it's a weird moment. Like, I don't know if he's proud that he can do this now. He certainly feels like he has to explain himself to his parents who haven't experienced anything like this.
Yeah.
And the challenges that were tremendous during the Civil War are how do you clean up after a battle, right? After Gettysburg, the residents of that town for months were walking around, not just with the mussy tussies or the nosegays, but carrying limes and carbolic acid and all of these like really strong disinfectants to try to counter that overwhelming stench that was coming from the battlefields. And so there is a bit in the book about who ends up doing the burying and why they get assigned to do it. There's the idea, which is racist, but was widely shared, that African Americans weren't as sensitive to the odors, that somehow they didn't like affect their health in the same way. And so many of the slaves who went to Union lines seeking freedom ended up being put on burial detail, especially after these large battles. It's a terrible task. Someone has to do it. In terms of how they handled the animal waste, right? Like all the horse shit. I don't know. I didn't find anywhere that someone wrote that down, but of course, that's
Yeah.
a big part of like how did they operate the camps. The one thing that I can say from the documentation is that they did, the army starts creating guidelines for where you can keep the animals, how far away they need to be from the tents. So they are trying to at least use space as a buffer for all of those smells.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too, in when you're saying that the latrines had to be 150 yards from the camp, and that they had a sense, even if they didn't understand, that the smell wasn't carrying bacteria, or that germ theory wasn't around, but they had some sense that keeping this thing separate, was an aid in that.
And aren't we glad they figured that out?
Oh yeah.
Yes. And I
Well,
know
yeah.
I know after a battle for the dead bodies of the horses, they would often just burn them
Yeah.
rather than bury them, because it was so difficult to bury them, and burying, they'd have to dig really deep holes.
Oh yeah.
So they would just stack them and burn them. So that's gonna smell pretty bad too.
Yeah. I mean, the advantage there is that it's kind of like one and done, as opposed to
Right.
letting the bodies rot for
Right.
months on end.
Hmm.
But either way, that's not a good smell.
No.
No, that's not a good smell either. And we actually have a comment from Ken Derenbacher, who says he recalls a quote actually of a visitor to Antietam battlefield that they could smell the field 2 miles before they actually arrived at it.
Yeah.
I know that's a lot
believe
of,
that.
the accounts of Gettysburg talk about how many flies are around, that there's all these other aspects. And I thought that was interesting in your book too, that the after battle is horrific also, as the battle.
And when we talk about the Civil War, we often we're focused on the battles and how the battles played out, and just don't spend as much time thinking about like what had to happen after the battle ended. But that's a tremendous amount of work that many someones had to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Tracy?
Okay. Well, since you mentioned about the African Americans, they had the misconception that they could stand the bad smells better than the white soldiers. We know that they also had the misconception that African Americans were more tolerant of malarial type diseases, and so they suffered disproportionately as far as sickness goes. Their death rate from sickness was much higher than the white soldiers. But there's a section in your book that mentions about the perceived smell of African Americans versus the
Ah.
perceived smell of white people, and that was very disturbing.
Mm-hmm. So I was mostly focused on the environment in the book and didn't write a lot about body odor, although there's certainly plenty to be said about body odor in the 19th century or any century, to be honest. But it was really striking as Americans were pondering how their society would be different if all of these enslaved African Americans are free and are sharing space with the rest of Americans. One of the arguments that frequently came up is that this would be like unhealthy because of the odors of African American bodies. And the literature on the smell of African Americans goes back to Thomas Jefferson. Everything goes back to Thomas Jefferson. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he said that, that the bodies of Black men, some of them might have been Africans, not just African Americans, had a particularly strong odor. He doesn't stop, Jefferson, to think about all of the labor that these people are doing for him,
Oh, no.
like heavy physical labor that he's not doing. And in fact, that might be the reason that they have such a strong odor. But people loved Thomas Jefferson. People read Notes on the State of Virginia, and that idea about odor, just keeps coming up throughout the 19th century. So it's one of the arguments that people who don't want to see enslaved people become free and be citizens are making. And then other people argue against that. And what they do is they point out that children play together. They don't notice that there's any difference. And they talk about how all of these very wealthy white people in the North are constantly being served by African Americans in fancy hotel rooms and ballrooms, and they never pause to say that there's a bad smell. So people are like really pulling this out and teasing this apart, that this is a cultural belief. It's not a reality. And I think that that is a really fascinating thing that's also happening with smell. In the course of the Civil War, that people are trying to figure the many things out about how smells operate in their society.
Right. That was really a really interesting aspect. And it was just one of those arguments, I guess, that the pro-slavery movement was using.
Mhm.
They were pulling out of their hat and saying, hey, how about this? Do you have any more questions, Melissa?
No, we don't have any right now. So if you have a question, please drop them in the comments. But Tracy, I'll let you take a couple more.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask some general questions now. I'm sure people are thinking, how did you get the idea for this book?
Yeah.
That is a great question, and I wish the answer were more exciting. When I started graduate school, I was introduced to sensory history as a new thing that historians were doing, studying the sense of, sight, vision, sound. There were a lot of books about sound. And so I did the thing that a typical graduate student does, where I surveyed all the literature and I recognized that there weren't that many people writing about smell. Almost no one at that time. So I decided I should do that. And I didn't realize just how hard that is to do. And I think this is one of the reasons that it hadn't been taken up yet. When we think about smell, it's been called the mute sense. And that muteness is in two different ways. One is that we're taught it's not polite to talk about smells. So you think about as a kid, certainly your parents or someone told you not to say anything when someone smelled funny, when a house smelled funny, right? You weren't supposed to talk about it. You were just, And so one of the things I recognized is that that's an old cultural guidance, but if people felt the need not only to talk about it, but write it down, to write to a newspaper editor, there must have been something serious going on. So I wanted to pay attention to that. The other reason that smell is the mute sense is we just don't have as many words for smells as we do for textures or for sounds or for flavors. Our vocabulary is really limited. I say in the introduction that if I tell you something smells like a skunk, that means nothing to you unless you've smelled a skunk. And so, but so many of our descriptions are smells like, as opposed to like words that would conjure the smell itself for us. And that also makes it harder for people to write about smells, makes it harder to research smells as a historian. So it was a challenge, but I'm glad I was able to do it. And the whole book exists so you don't have to do the work yourself.
Yeah, I'm glad you did it too. Was there a particular fact that surprised you the most in the course of your research?
There were so many little things I had never thought about, but that made sense once I thought about it in terms of the smell. And so I don't think I can point to any like, aha moment. But one of the things that was constantly surprising to me was once I figured out how people talked about smell in the 19th century, I found it everywhere, right? So I started off with the idea that smell was going to be very difficult to research because it's the mute sense. But once I figured it out, I could really see it. Like every illustration of people of, like a city crowd where everyone's got flowers. It's like, wow, now that I understand what they're doing with those flowers,
Yeah.
it just gives us a sense of like how bad it must smell and how concerned everyone is. And so there were little things like that that just sort of changed the way I looked at um, the images and the documents from the 19th century. Once I understood smell, it's there. I just had to see it in a way that I hadn't before.
Right. In the book, you provide some examples of like some of the illustrations where the smells are actually look like smoke coming out. And that's how they illustrated the fact that there was an odor there, even though it might not really in real life be visible, but that's how they depicted it in the drawings. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. I love the illustrations. That's another thing I want to plug for the book. I was able to put in almost every image that I wanted. So you'll be able to get a sense of like what I was using and how smell is present in all those different places.
Yeah, the illustrations were awesome. I really, really enjoyed those.
We
Any
have a
other
question
questions?
actually about, your research. If you used any, is considering that you're talking about smell, if you used any sort of method research to, expose yourself to smells that maybe you weren't familiar with, or how did you interact with smell to write about smell?
Fantastic question. I had a huge advantage with the fact that I grew up on a dairy farm. So, like, I would read all of these like lurid descriptions of manure spattered walls, and I was like, yep, I know what
Yeah.
that's like. And so I do think that that really helped me with a lot of the things. However, I did not try to recreate any odors in the course of my
Okay.
research. A lot of people were like, oh, you should, combine forces with a smell chemist. And all I could think, especially when I was giving presentations in rooms to people, so not on Zoom, is how if I released one of the smells that I was talking about, I would just like everyone would leave.
You would vacate the room.
Yeah. Um, there are not as many good smells in the book as there are horrible stenches. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I think it's a great question, and there is a new book, it's newer than mine, by a historian in England by the name of William Tullett, where he does walk you through how you can recreate the odors, not of the Civil War, but different odors from historic periods and experience them and understand the way they were described by people who lived then. So
Wow.
one of the things I think is interesting is like the idea that they put iodine under the beds to make it smell better.
Mhm.
Iodine's not something I think of as smelling well.
Right.
Um, but it does have a reaction with things in the air. And so he explains how to have that reaction. So you'll understand why iodine, or in his example, I think it's alkali, how it smells fresh.
Right.
Because that's not an automatic association that you would have. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, we have
Interesting.
somebody actually asking about mercury. Was that something that was used in treatment, and whether that, was something that impacted whether, they lived or died through these process or procedures?
Yeah, I mean, mercury has been used in medicine going back to the ancient world, so they were certainly using it. I don't believe mercury has an odor. It certainly didn't come up in my smell research.
Okay.
Um, but it depends on the dosage. Mercury, of course, is a poison. I want to make sure
Yeah.
everyone knows that, just in case. Do not dose yourselves with mercury. Um, so physicians
Don't,
would
please.
use it. But it didn't necessarily cure their patients. Or, sometimes the cure is worse than the ailment.
Yeah.
And with mercury, yeah, it's a dangerous thing to be using.
Yep.
Right. Looks like we just have a few more minutes. Any more questions, Melissa?
Nope, I don't have any more questions online. I had a question actually. I was really fascinated with the Civil War aspect that you were talking about, where soldiers don't have choice in where they're living as opposed to people in, cities. And, at the same time that the cities are sort of dealing with these new odors and trying to regulate them, Civil War soldiers might have been a little bit more accepting of regulators coming in and having something to do with it, and how that might impact after the war, the regulation of odors. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, the Civil War is really this kind of, I mean, it's not unique. It's not the only time that lots of men are drafted all of a sudden into war. But what's happening in the Civil War is you're taking all of these people who have probably not encountered a physician in their day-to-day lives, and you're making them subject to military discipline. There are lots of books about how difficult it was to apply military discipline to these sudden volunteers. Um, a lot of them didn't necessarily sign up for military discipline, but when the Sanitary Commission is created, it's a civilian organization that has authority within the army, which is a really strange thing. Um, but that gives the physicians, more authority than they would have in day-to-day life anywhere, right? Outside of the war. And so they are actively trying to figure this out, to figure out sanitary guidelines and to create them for all the camps in order to keep men healthy. So, we don't, we think about the Civil War and we think about, it's a war to end slavery. There are all these other concerns that are really at the fore. But how do you keep soldiers healthy so they can fight? Like, this is what the Sanitary Commission was trying to figure out. And a lot of their rules and regulations, Hammond, the Surgeon General I mentioned, he creates, the first medical regulations for an army. And that's still in use. Like, those things have been updated,
Yeah.
certainly, but the principles go back to the Civil War when we talk about the United States Army.
And that's something that our museum always tries to do, is connect the
Yeah.
past with the present. The medical improvements that occurred during the Civil War, the idea of triage and ambulances and all of that sort of thing carried forward into modern military and civilian life. So yeah, excellent lesson.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We can learn from the past for sure.
absolutely. There's a lot for
Mhm.
us to learn from the past.
Well, it looks like we're coming up on 8 o'clock. So thank you so much, Melanie. This has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you taking part. And thank you to everyone that submitted questions and that tuned in tonight. And please keep an eye on our Facebook page for our next Meet the Author event. We'll have Melissa will be putting that up eventually, and we'll have our another author and another book available for you folks to be part of the discussion. So in the meantime, thank you for tuning in, and everyone have a good evening.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.